The 2010s were an insane decade for racing games, and that decade had two different sides to it. On one side you had the titans like Forza, which was rising to its dominance, Gran Turismo was still carrying that prestige, and Need for Speed was constantly reinventing itself. I mean, sometimes successfully, sometimes maybe not so much, but underneath those heavy hitters, there were games experimenting and taking risks and trying some new ideas, and some of them were genuinely really good. Today we're talking about racing games from the 2010s that deserved way more attention than they got. Hopefully there'll be something here that you've not heard of before that maybe after this you can go and check out. Or maybe you've heard of them all because you know a lot about racing games. But anyway, before we jump onto the list, we need to start with an honourable mention. So to kick off, this is ModNation Racers, my honourable mention for this video. The reason it's an honourable mention is because I very recently covered this game in my underrated PSP racing games video, so it's already had its own segment in like the last week. But anyway, if you owned a PS3 in 2010, you probably remember the marketing push behind ModNation Racers. Sony was basically positioning it as their answer to Mario Kart, but if I were to call it a clone, then that would be missing the point entirely. Because what made ModNation Racers special wasn't just the racing, of course, it was the creation tools. You could design your own driver from scratch, customize your kart piece by piece, and the best part, build entire tracks with elevation changes, jumps, shortcuts, so on and so forth. And this was 2010, so user-generated content wasn't nearly as mainstream as it is today. The track editor was surprisingly deep, you could sculpt terrain like it was clay, build banked corners, and create some wild rollercoaster style circuits. And the online sharing system actually worked. The driving was a little bit floaty, yeah sure, and the load times weren't great, but the creativity was unmatched for a kart racer at the time. And it had a dedicated community. People were designing tracks that, to be honest, rivaled and were better than developer-made ones. Yes, it would go on to get a kind of sequel on the PS Vita, but in my opinion this is a franchise that should still be going today. On PS4, PS5, it should have had sequels on the home consoles as well. Anyway, unfortunately the series slowly faded, but if we're talking ambition in racing games, ModNation Racers definitely belongs in the conversation. Now let's move on to the main list. So this is Blur, and Blur might be the biggest how did this not take off story on this list. This was developed by Bizarre Creations, as in the same studio behind Project Gotham Racing and Metropolis Street Racer. Blur was a fascinating mashup. Imagine real licensed cars, real world city tracks, but with arcade handling and Mario Kart style power-ups. It sounds chaotic, and it kinda was. But here's what made Blur different. It still respected racing skill. You couldn't just rely on power-ups to win because drifting mattered, taking racing lines mattered, and managing boost and defensive abilities also mattered. The power-ups were okay, they were pretty layered, shields, mines, homing attacks. You could use them and stack them strategically. And multiplayer was where this game truly shined. Split-screen chaos, online ranked playlists, some decent skill-based matchmaking before that became standard. But the problem was, well, I guess the timing. It launched in 2010, which was a year packed with major releases, and it was kinda hard to market because it was too arcade for sim fans, but too realistic for kart fans. It kinda lived in this awkward middle ground. But today, that middle ground feels really refreshing. Blur was competitive, chaotic, and skill-driven in a way that still feels modern today, and it did not deserve to disappear as quickly as it did and should have had a sequel. On top of this, the game would review very well across all versions released, so that was PS3, Xbox 360, and PC, where all versions held a score between 81 to 82 on Metacritic, and it currently holds an 8.1 user score. Unfortunately, the game wouldn't be the best seller across all of its platforms, selling 500,000 units across the two consoles and PC, which, when you divide it on platform to platform and compare it to other big racing franchises at the time, isn't as much, and it's a shame because this game should have sold well, or at least better than it did, and gone on to start its own franchise, but of course Bizarre Creations is now sadly long gone. In fact, Blur was one of their last ever games before Activision shut them down, so thanks a bunch Activision, I guess. Now before we go any further, if you're a fan of racing games, then please consider hitting that subscribe button and tapping the bell to stay up to date with my future uploads. And if you haven't done so already, please consider hitting that like button because it helps out a lot more than you might think. Anyway, let's move on to our next game, and that is Test Drive Unlimited 2. Now, this one was very ambitious. Test Drive Unlimited 2 wasn't just trying to be a racing game, it was aiming for more of a lifestyle experience vibe. Massive open worlds based on Ibiza and Hawaii. You could buy mansions and apartments, walk inside dealerships, change your clothes, visit social hubs, challenge players organically, and this was before open world racing was dominating the genre. The sense of scale in this game was insane. You could drive for real life distances without hitting invisible walls, cruise coastal highways in a convertible Ferrari, join online car meets. It felt like an early prototype of what modern racing games would become. Was the handling perfect? Not really. Were there bugs at launch? Yes, there were. But the vision was massive. It leaned heavily into atmosphere, the soundtrack, the sunset lighting, the freedom to just cruise around and do whatever you wanted. It walked so games like Forza Horizon could run. And that's why this game deserves a lot of recognition, because it took everything about the first Unlimited and just made it bigger. Now, whilst the first game was a massive hit and reviewed really well, unfortunately Unlimited 2 did not hold a score quite as high. It was released across 3 different platforms again, so PS3, 360 and PC, and across those versions we have a 68, a 70 and a 72 out of 100, with a user score across the board of about a 6.9 to 7 out of 10. The game would still go on to sell pretty damn well, with 1.8 million units shifted across all 3 different platforms, so definitely a lot better than Blur did. And as I'm sure you may know, Test Drive Unlimited did eventually return with Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown, which is, well, certainly a video game, and a video game I intend to tackle in a video one day, but I have not yet got around to playing it. So next up we have what might be the most tragic story on this list, Driveclub. When it was first revealed, it was positioned as a flagship PS4 title, a showcase racer, a technical powerhouse, or some would call it a social racing revolution. And then when it launched, it was, well, broken. The server failures crippled the club system, which was literally the core feature and main selling point of the game. The PlayStation Plus free version was delayed for months, and unfortunately the review scores reflected frustration more than the actual driving experience. And of course, in today's gaming landscape, first impressions are everything. And here's what gets overlooked. Underneath those server issues was a genuinely special racing game. Let's talk about the driving, because Driveclub wasn't a pure sim, but it wasn't arcade either. It sat in this sweet middle ground. Heavy weighty cars that demanded respect, but still accessible enough to slide around with confidence, and that most people could just pick up and play. There was a real sense of mass to each vehicle, and when you clipped a curb at high speed, you felt it. When you pushed too hard into a wet corner, the car would punish you, but it didn't feel unfair. And then there's the presentation. Even now, over a decade later, Driveclub's weather system holds up. Rain wasn't just a texture overlay, it interacted with light, it distorted reflections, it pulled on the track's surface. At night, racing through a storm felt almost cinematic. The combination of sound design and dynamic lighting created this immersive intensity that very few races have matched since. And the sound design was absolutely brutal in the best possible way. Engines roared with deep mechanical texture, downshifts cracked, turbo flutter echoed through tunnels. But the most underrated part of Driveclub for me was its club progression system. You joined or created a club with other players, every race you completed contributed points to said club, challenges rotated constantly, leaderboards weren't just global, they were a social thing. It felt collaborative without being forced, competitive without being too toxic. Over time, the developers, Evolution Studios, fixed the servers, added bikes in a full expansion, introduced new tracks, refined physics, and transformed the game into something far stronger than its launch state. And then, it got delisted. In 2020, Driveclub was officially delisted from digital storefronts due to licensing expirations. I'm so bored of hearing that when it comes to delisting. It's always licensing, and that's it. No more digital purchases, servers shut down, Physical copies still work offline, but the social component that defined the game is gone, which makes this game even more bittersweet. Driveclub didn't fail because it lacked quality, it failed because of timing, launch issues, and momentum. The game would go on to review at about 71 out of 100 on Metacritic with a user score of 6.4 out of 10. I'm sure you already knew this, but if you didn't, this was a PlayStation 4 exclusive. The game did sell really well with nearly 5 million units shifted, but I think this one's underrated because it's just faded into time thanks to its delisting. So moving on, when people think of Formula 1 games, they think of realism. Tyre compounds, DRS, ERS, sim-heavy career modes. So when Codemasters announced F1 Race Stars, a cartoon racer with big-headed caricatures of real drivers, the reaction was confusion. But here's the thing, F1 Race Stars understood something important. The Formula 1 brand is global, it's multi-generational, and not everyone wants a hyper-technical sim. This game took real circuits, Monaco, Silverstone, Monza, and reimagined them like theme park roller coasters. Massive elevation changes, shortcut routes, exaggerated landmarks, and looping track designs. They weren't just shrunk down circuits, they were creative reinterpretations. And the power-up system was fairly well balanced. Boost bursts, defensive bubbles, oil slicks, track hazards. It wasn't as chaotic as Mario Kart, but it wasn't shallow either. The handling model was tighter than you'd expect. Boost management mattered, track knowledge mattered. The only thing was, it was a kart racer and there was no drifting, but that is also because it's F1. The game had some decent split-screen multiplayer, and really, F1 Race Stars filled a niche. It allowed families and casual players to enjoy the F1 universe without needing to understand pit strategy or tyre degradation. And visually, I think it's aged really well. The stylized art direction means it doesn't suffer the same graphical aging that realism-focused games often do. It even had a decent online component and some post-launch support with some DLC. So why didn't it blow up? Well, because it kinda lived in an awkward space. The hardcore F1 fans dismissed it as too childish, and kart racer fans stuck with Nintendo's dominance. But in retrospect, it was very creative, it was polished, and bold. And we honestly don't get many big-budget experimental spin-offs like this anymore, which makes F1 Race Stars feel like a relic of a more playful era in licensed games. The game reviewed alright, with scores between 61 to 64, depending on the platform it was on, and this was a game that launched on the 360, PS3, PC, and eventually got ported to Wii U as well. The user score is sat at about 6.6, so it's fairly similar as well, but I personally really like this game. Across all platforms, the game would go on to sell about 600,000 copies, which isn't too bad going, but not that great in terms of F1 sales. Anyway, if you're super interested in this game, then I actually have done a full video on it, so go and check that one out after this video. And moving on to something a little bit different for the final game of this video. This is Fast RMX. Developed by Shin-En, this game was a launch title for the Nintendo Switch back in 2017, and quietly became one of the most technically impressive titles on the system. And not just at the time, I still think it is to this day. It held 60 FPS, it had dynamic lighting, some really cool track design, and it performed really well both in docked and handheld mode. But what makes the game stand out for me is the phase switching mechanic. Your vehicle has two energy phases, blue and orange. The track is lined with matching boost pads, and if you match your phase to the colour, you get a speed boost. If you don't, well, you lose momentum. And at 300 miles per hour equivalent speeds, that split decision making becomes very intense. You're steering, boosting, avoiding rivals, switching phases mid-corner. It creates this rhythmic, almost musical flow once you master it. The track design is vertical and ambitious, giant drops, twisting skyways, futuristic cities, and unlike some futuristic racers that feel floaty, Fast RMX has tight, responsive handling. You feel in control, but the speed is punishing, and if you make one mistake on the higher difficulties, that's it. You're losing. It also supports split-screen multiplayer and handles it very smoothly. And this is a game that's underrated because it kind of launched quietly, it wasn't tied to a massive franchise, and it kind of exists in the shadow of the dormant F-Zero series that we're constantly waiting to return. But in many ways, Fast RMX is the spiritual successor that people were asking for. It's challenging, skill-based, and performance-focused. So the game was a Nintendo Switch exclusive, and will review pretty well with 81 out of 100 and a matching 8.1 user score to go with it. Unfortunately, because this was a digital exclusive game, I don't really have any accurate sales figures to give you, but Fast RMX did go on to get a sequel just last year that was a Switch 2 launch title called Fast Fusion. And who knows, perhaps that will one day end up in a video of underrated 2020s racing games. The PlayStation 1 has one of the most diverse racing libraries in gaming history. Everyone remembers the big names, Gran Turismo, Ridge Racer, Wipeout, and Crash Team Racing. But with hundreds of racing games released on the system, some really good ones got buried. Today I want to spotlight 5 racing games on the PS1 that, in my opinion, are underrated and don't get talked about enough. They might not have sold millions, and they might not show up in every retro top 10 list, but each of them brought something unique to the table, so let's take them for a spin. So let's start with a game called Total Drivin, and that's Drivin without the G. It also has a few other names, such as Car and Driver Presents Grand Tour Racing 98, and that was in America, and M6 Turbo Racing in France. But here in the UK we know it as Total Drivin. The game was developed by a company known as Eutechnics, who we've actually covered on this channel before with a game called Ford vs Chevy, but they've worked on a variety of, well, middling racing titles such as Pimp My Ride, Street Racing Syndicate, and Big Mother Truckers, just to name a few. Anyway, the game released in October 1997 in America and Europe, and April 1998 in Japan. It didn't make a huge splash when it launched, but honestly it's one of the most ambitious races of the era. Instead of just sticking to one style of racing, it throws everything at you. You'll race rally cars across muddy off-road tracks, take sports cars onto traditional circuits, and even drive dune buggies through desert landscapes. The handling of course shifts depending on the terrain, so you really feel the difference between sliding through the dirt and gripping asphalt. The physics may seem rough compared to modern standards, but back then it gave the game a lot of personality, and the track design was surprisingly forward-thinking, with long courses, elevation changes, and shortcuts. It almost feels like a sampler platter of different racing subgenres. If you're the type who gets bored of doing the same thing over and over, Total Drivin is like a mini racing anthology wrapped into one game. In terms of its critical response, Total Drivin had some somewhat good reviews. On the now defunct Game Rankings, it held a 71% out of 100, so not terrible. Total Drivin definitely stands out as one of the better racing titles in the Eutechnics library, and is definitely one worth checking out. Now let's switch gears, way over to the kart racing side of things, with Muppet Racemania. At first glance you might think, oh, it's just another character kart racer riding on the success of Mario Kart and Crash Team Racing, but this one actually has a lot of charm and depth. So Muppet Racemania was developed by Traveller's Tales, also now known as TT Games, who you may know for the weird Weakest Link tie-in game, or, you know, a lot of LEGO games. The game released here in Europe in April of 2000 and would later release in America of October that same year. Now I may have a small amount of bias here as I love the Muppets, and Muppet Racemania was actually the first retrospective review I made on this channel, way back in 2023. But hear me out because the game is actually good. For one, the roster is massive. You get 25 Muppet characters, from icons like Kermit and Miss Piggy, to some more obscure fan favourites such as Bobo the Bear and Bean Bunny. Each character also gets their own themed vehicle, and there's variety in how they play. The tracks are packed with references to Muppet movies, as every single track is based on a location from one of the films. So you've got tracks from The Muppet Movie, The Muppets Christmas Carol, Muppet Treasure Island, and somehow more than that. As well as this, there's also some bonus tracks, such as a track from another Jim Henson property, Fraggle Rock. Traveller's Tales clearly poured a lot of love into making this feel like a celebration of Muppet history at the time. Now, the handling is a little looser than Crash Team Racing, so it might take some getting used to, but the sheer creativity in the environments, combined with secret paths and collectibles, makes Muppet Racemania worth revisiting. It's one of those games where the more time you spend with it, the more details you begin to notice. Now, in terms of critical response, Muppet Racemania received kind of positive to average reviews, with a 70% on game rankings. And the game was estimated to have sold about 150,000 units. Those figures are from VG Charts. So on the other end of the racing spectrum is a game called Motorhead, a futuristic racer that really stood out at the time for its speed and presentation. So this game's full title is Motorhead High Velocity Entertainment, and it was developed by Digital Illusion CE AB. Now you may know them today as part of EA, called DICE, as in the Battlefield developers. Anyway, this game of course released on the original PlayStation, but also saw a release on Windows PCs. So the game released on PlayStation here in Europe in April 1998, and in America in November 1998. The European Windows release was October that same year, and in America, March 1999. Now this was a futuristic game by design, but unlike Wipeout, which was all about anti-gravity, Motorhead keeps you grounded in cars, but these cars look like sleek futuristic machines, like something out of Blade Runner. The tracks are long, flowing and filled with neon lights, reflective surfaces and skyscraper backdrops. Now, this futuristic setup was one of the unique selling points of the game, but another was how smoothly the game ran. There were some PS1 racers that did struggle with frame rates a little bit, but Motorhead was silky in comparison, which makes it feel faster and more responsive. The gameplay is straightforward, no weapons, no gimmicks, just fast-paced arcade-style racing. It rewards precision driving, mastering corners, and knowing when to take risks. If you ever wanted Ridge Racer and Wipeout to have a child, well, here it is. It didn't get nearly the recognition of its competitors, but for niche racing fans, Motorhead is still a thrill to play today. In terms of critical response, the PC version held a 71% on game rankings, but the PlayStation version was a little below this, at 65%, which made it a bit of an average response. Now, of course, you can't talk about PS1 racing without Ridge Racer, but instead of the big hits, I want to highlight the overlooked Rage Racer. Rage Racer was developed by Namco, who brought you the other Ridge Racer titles, as well as Pac-Man, and was released in December 1996 in Japan, May 1997 in America, and June that same year in Europe. It was sandwiched between Ridge Racer Revolution and the more famous Ridge Racer Type 4, and as a result, it kind of got lost in the shuffle. But it actually introduced a lot of ideas that the series would later refine. First, the tone. Unlike the bright, colourful style of earlier Ridge Racer entries, Rage Racer leaned into a darker, moodier atmosphere. The tracks had industrial cityscapes, overcast skies, and a more serious vibe. And of course the music followed suit, swapping out the cheerful techno beats for gritty industrial and trance tracks. It also added a progression system, which was new to the series. Instead of just picking cars from a menu, you earned credits by racing and could spend them on upgrades or new vehicles. That sense of progression and customization gave the game a lot more longevity. In many ways, Rage Racer was the experimental bridge between the arcade simplicity of the early games and the polish of Ridge Racer Type 4. If you're a fan of the series and you skipped this one, it's definitely worth going back. Now, in terms of the game's critical response, the general consensus was positive. It held an 83% score on game rankings. It would also go on to shift over 1 million units. However, the bulk of these sales were from Japan. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, then please let me know what your favourite PS1 racing game is in the comments down below. And finally, let's talk about Porsche Challenge. So Porsche Challenge was developed and published by Sony Computer Entertainment, with the Europe division being responsible for the development side. This developer would later be known as Team Soho. Anyway, the game was released in Europe in April of 1997, in America it was August 1997, and Japan September that same year. This one is a little unusual because the entire game is built around a single car, the Porsche Boxster. That might sound like a limitation, but what it actually did was allow the developers to fine-tune the handling and presentation to an impressive degree. Before starting a race, you have to choose from a selection of Porsche Boxsters, and each one of these Porsches has a different driver, and each driver has a different personality. These drivers will comment on how other drivers drive and perform, usually remarking that they are better than the opponents. The car feels weighty, grounded, and responsive in a way that stood out from a lot of the more arcade-focused races at the time. It's not a full-on sim like Gran Turismo, but it lands somewhere in between. Easy to pick up, but with enough realism to keep you invested. The tracks are stylish and scenic, with sharp visuals and some surprisingly nice reflections for a PS1 game. And while it doesn't have the variety of other racers, the attention to detail makes it a really satisfying experience. If you think of it less as a racing game with hundreds of cars and more as a focused driving showcase, Porsche Challenge shines as a hidden treasure in the PS1 library. Now, in terms of the critical response to Porsche Challenge, it received a decent score of 73% on GameRankings, with the game estimated to have sold about 100,000, which really isn't terrible when you consider this is a game about one single car. So there you have it, 5 underrated PS1 racing games that I think are worth revisiting. Each one has its own unique flavour, whether it's the variety of Total Drivin, the creativity of Muppet Racemania, the raw speed of Motorhead, the experimental grit of Rage Racer, or the focused polish of Porsche Challenge. The PlayStation was an absolute goldmine for racing games, and even decades later there are still gems to rediscover. Vanishing Point. Released in the twilight years of PlayStation's life, Vanishing Point was developed by Clockwork Games and published by Acclaim Entertainment, launching on the original PlayStation in February and March 2001, depending on where you lived in the world. You can see straight away that visually the game looks really good and the frame rate is surprisingly stable, especially considering how much was going on visually. But here's what really made this game special. Everything was simulated. No pre-baked animations, no simple grip systems, just raw physics. Every suspension bounce, every bit of tyre friction was supposedly being calculated in real time. It makes the cars feel alive, sometimes twitchy, weighty, and unpredictable. It kind of feels more modern than it looks. The game's name wasn't just stylish either, it reflected the design. You weren't technically racing against other cars, instead you competed against ghost data, meaning every race felt like a personal challenge, a battle to perfect your line and shave milliseconds off your time. It gave Vanishing Point a strangely futuristic atmosphere, but also hypnotic. And the environments were massive for their time, with long stretches of highway, sweeping coastal roads, and detailed cityscapes. It kind of feels like a playable tech demo, but it actually has depth. Sadly, the game released a little too late, right as the PS2 and Dreamcast were taking over, and it did even receive a port to the Dreamcast. But today, Vanishing Point stands as a technical masterpiece that squeezed every last drop out of Sony's little grey box. Despite releasing after the PS2 had already launched, Vanishing Point on PS1 would go on to sell approximately 100,000 copies, which is still pretty impressive, and these figures are from VG Charts. The game on PlayStation 1 currently holds a 68 out of 100 on Metacritic as well, so not great, but not terrible. So next up, one that probably flew right past you unless you are under 12 or browsing the family section at your local game shop. Walt Disney World Quest Magical Racing Tour might look like a cute kart racer for kids, but this one hides some serious craftsmanship under the mouse ears. Developed by Crystal Dynamics, yes, the same team that made Gex and later Tomb Raider titles, as well as that horrible Avengers game, this 2000 release was based loosely on attractions from the actual Disney World parks. What's wild is how much detail they managed to pack in. Each track is themed after a real ride: Space Mountain, Big Thunder Mountain, Haunted Mansion, Pirates of the Caribbean, and they're not just loose interpretations. You'll see recognisable set pieces, working props, even snippets of the original attraction music remixed into racing form. Gameplay wise, it's pretty tight. The controls feel closer to Crash Team Racing than to Mario Kart, with sharp corners, weapon pickups, and responsive steering. There's also a fun little story mode where you collect lost fireworks to restore the park's nightly show. It's light-hearted, sure, but it gives the game some motivation beyond just race and win. The presentation is pure Disney magic, but the performance and design are Crystal Dynamics through and through. Slick, smooth, and surprisingly technical. Now, if you play this one today, I think you'll be genuinely impressed with how well it holds up. It's a perfect reminder that behind every corporate tie-in, there might just be a group of developers having fun and sneaking actual quality into the mix. And this wasn't the only good Disney kart racer on the PS1, because you had Toy Story Racer and Muppet Racemania. Now, the game would go on to sell pretty well on the original PlayStation, with approximately 450,000 copies sold. The game currently holds a 65 out of 100 on Metacritic, so again, not great but not bad either. However, the user score is a generally favourable 7.9 out of 10, so at least things are more positive there. So next up, before TrackMania or Burnout made outrageous stunt driving mainstream, there was Hot Wheels Turbo Racing. Developed by Stormfront Studios and published by EA in late 1999, this game fully embraced the fantasy of those bright orange tracks that we all had as kids. Big loops, ridiculous jumps, turbo pads that launched you halfway across the map. It felt like someone made a racing game out of pure sugar rush. What really stands out though is how good it feels to play. The turbo mechanic isn't just a gimmick, it's basically the whole game. You build your meter through tricks and boosts, and timing your nitro perfectly can make or break a race. The level design is equally wild, if not the most impressive thing here. Tracks twist through lava-filled volcanoes, snowy cliffs, and giant toy rooms, always teetering between chaos and control. And then there's the soundtrack. Oh man, the soundtrack. Including songs from Metallica, it's like someone handed the PS1 a can of Monster and said go nuts. It was fast, flashy, and totally unpretentious. Hot Wheels Turbo Racing didn't care about realism, it cared about fun, and you best believe it nailed that. It also quietly laid the groundwork for the kind of over-the-top arcade physics that games like Burnout would later perfect. Hot Wheels Turbo Racing would also go on to sell very well, with over 1 million units shifted in its lifetime. And whilst the game doesn't have a Metacritic score, it did hold a 73% on the now defunct Game Rankings, which is pretty good going. If you want to relive what pure 1999 fun felt like, no story, no seriousness, just speed and stunts, this game is worth tracking down and playing. Now, moving on to something a little more grounded. C3 Racing Car Constructors Championship from UK studio Eutechnyx. The game was published by Infogrames Multimedia and was released exclusively on the PlayStation in late 1998 and January 1999. If you've never heard of it, that's probably because it was quietly published under a different name in different places around the world. In some regions, it was just called Max Power Racing. The game doesn't reinvent the wheel, but what it does offer is a solid, feature-rich experience that feels like a hidden, budget gem. You race across 11 countries with unique environments ranging from European streets to Australian deserts, with each win progressing you towards unlocking new tracks and unlocking new cars. Speaking of cars, the game had a nice lineup of different vehicles to choose from, including the Peugeot 306, the Renault Clio, the Toyota Corolla, and the Skoda Octavia, just to name a few. The visuals are sharp, the draw distance is impressive, and the soundtrack has that distinctly 90s Euro rave vibe that just screams PlayStation racing. Eutechnyx would later go on to develop major licensed titles like NASCAR and Ride to Hell. Okay, maybe not their proudest moment, but C3 Racing showed they knew how to make a tight, enjoyable driving experience even back then. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find any sales figures for this game, which would probably suggest it didn't sell too well, but I'll leave that up to you to speculate on. And as well as not finding any sales figures, it's quite hard to find a good review score for this game. So just to give you some examples, a variety of different magazines such as the official UK PlayStation magazine rated it around the 7 out of 10 mark or in the 70 to 75% realm. Now this game might not be flashy, but it's one of those games that quietly grows on you. Perfectly balanced between arcade and simulation, and still fun in short bursts today. And now we end with one of the most technically impressive rally games of the PS1 era, Michelin Rally Masters Race of Champions. Developed by Digital Illusion CE, or DICE as we now know them, this game was a massive step forward for realistic vehicle handling. The game was published by Infogrames and released on Windows and PlayStation across 2000 depending on where you lived in the world. And of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, DICE would later go on to be the developer for the Battlefield series. Anyway, let's focus on the rallying. Built around the actual Race of Champions event, where the world's best rally and circuit drivers compete, it offered an amazing mix of realism and accessibility. The physics engine was really good, cars had real suspension movement, weight transfer and surface feedback. On gravel you could feel the car wobble beneath you, and on snow you could feel the slide. Visually, it pushed the PS1 to its limits, with dynamic lighting, dirt effects, and even some basic reflections on car windows. And the sense of speed was visceral, the crashes felt brutal, and the replays looked almost like television broadcasts. It also featured real drivers like Carlos Sainz, plus authentic cars from rally legends like Mitsubishi and Toyota, all officially licensed, which was rare for a smaller title. Now, whilst the game reviewed very well with a 79% on game rankings, unfortunately again I wasn't able to find any sales figures, which would suggest it barely made a dent commercially. By 2000, Rally fans were already locked onto Colin McRae, and Rally Masters was sadly left in the dust. But in hindsight, it's one of those games that showed just how far the PS1 could go, and hinted at the incredible technical DNA DICE would carry into Battlefield years later. The Xbox 360 era gave us some truly great racing games, Forza Motorsport, Burnout Paradise, Need for Speed, but not every great racer got the spotlight it deserved. Hidden among the heavy hitters were a few absolute gems, creative, stylish, and endlessly fun, that quietly became fan favourites for those who discovered them. In this video we're taking a ride through 5 underrated Xbox 360 racing games that still hold up today. There's no ranking here, just 5 great titles that deserve a second lap around the track. So in no particular order, let's kick things off with one of the smoothest, most stylish racers ever made, OutRun Online Arcade. Sumo Digital and Sega brought this legendary arcade series to the Xbox 360 in 2009, giving fans a gorgeous HD update, or conversion really, of OutRun 2006 coast to coast. The setup is pure arcade bliss. You, your Ferrari, an open road, and branching paths that let you choose your route in real time. Every track oozes that classic Sega charm: palm trees, coastal highways, sunsets, and of course, that incredible soundtrack. It's fast, fluid, and built around drifting, simple to play, but surprisingly hard to master. Now, I spent a lot of time with 2006 Coast to Coast when I was younger, and I'm pleased to say that I also spent a lot of time with Online Arcade as well, and they are both fantastically addictive games. And whilst there isn't actually that much game in Online Arcade, with all the different branching paths, there's still quite a lot to keep you coming back, and you gotta keep trying to beat your high score. Visually, both the environment and the cars look fantastic, it's all bright, it's all colourful, it's all just pure arcade gold. Sadly, OutRun Online Arcade was delisted due to Ferrari licensing issues, so unless you already own it, it's kinda tough to play today, and not to mention the 360 store is now gone anyway. So the game had 15 courses and 10 licensed Ferraris. It also had online head-to-head play for up to 6 players, but the main selling point was definitely having OutRun in HD graphics. Now, interestingly enough, The release of this game was prior to Microsoft raising the maximum size of Xbox Live Arcade titles up to 2 gig, which actually happened later that same year, but because of this, Sumo Digital had only 350 megabytes to fit the game in. So that's probably why there isn't so much game here, because they physically couldn't fit it in. Now, it would have been nice to have seen some more added back as DLC, but that never happened, and then the game was delisted like a year later anyway. Now, in terms of review scores, the 360 version holds a 79 out of 100 on Metacritic, with the PS3 port holding just one score lower at 78. And whilst we don't have any accurate sales figures for this game because of it being an online exclusive, it was first in sales on the Xbox Live Arcade for the first 2 weeks following its release, so it must have sold pretty well. Sadly though, this is the latest entry in the series, so it has been over 15 years since we've had a new release. I'd love to see Sega go back to this series, but perhaps they haven't worked out a licensing deal with Ferrari, or perhaps they're just not interested in revisiting it. But maybe one day. I hope. But if you were lucky enough to experience this game at the time, you'd probably agree with me here. This is what racing games are all about. It's just pure driving joy. So next up, we're leaving the tarmac and Ferraris behind for something a little bit wetter. Hydro Thunder Hurricane. Hydro Thunder Hurricane was developed by Vector Unit and published by Microsoft, releasing on the 360 exclusively in July 2010. It would later get ported onto PC in November 2012. And this game is the sequel to the 90s arcade game Hydro Thunder. Now, much like OutRun, everything about this game screams arcade. The water physics, the over-the-top tracks, the massive jumps, and the secret shortcuts. It's pure chaos, but in the best possible way. Each environment feels alive: ancient temples, arctic glaciers, tropical islands, even stormy dams with massive waves that throw your boat around. It's also surprisingly technical, mastering how to use boost, cut corners, and land jumps cleanly takes practice. Visually, I think the game looks fantastic, the water looks amazing, the boats look amazing, and as I mentioned, the physics are really good. The sense of speed and control on water, in my opinion, is unmatched even today. As well as standard races, the game also added 3 additional single player modes, including a game mode called Ringmaster where you have to drive through a sequence of rings in the fastest time possible. On top of this, it also featured multiplayer with up to 4 players via split screen. And I love any game that has local multiplayer, so there we go. The game was released as part of the 3rd annual Xbox Live Summer of Arcade, if you guys remember those, alongside titles such as Limbo, which is pretty cool. Later on that same year, the game would also receive a DLC pack with 3 additional tracks and 2 additional boats, so it was nice to see some additional support for an Xbox Live Arcade title. The game went on to review pretty well, with a Metascore of 75 out of 100, which is still pretty good. The game sold very well on top of this, with the leaderboards registering over 300,000 players, as well as the DLC registering over 35,000 players, which is pretty good. If you want to pick this game up today, you can still buy and play this via backwards compatibility on Xbox One and Xbox Series for £8.30, which is a damn good price if you ask me for such a good game. And thankfully it's not a sad tale of the game being lost to the Xbox 360 store or the game getting delisted, so that's always a bonus for game preservation. I think this game is easily one of the best digital racers on the 360, and it's a reminder that arcade fun never goes out of style. Now for something muddy, fast, and full of airtime. Pure from Black Rock Studio and Disney Interactive. Black Rock Studio were formerly known as Climax Racing and Climax Brighton, who gave us titles from the MotoGP series, as well as Hot Wheels World Race, one of my personal favourites, and Crash and Burn. Anyway, let's focus on Pure. So, Pure is an off-road ATV racer that focused on stunts, flow, and verticality. It's definitely not about realism, it's about launching off cliffs, flipping your quad mid-air, and chaining tricks for massive boost rewards. The control feels snappy, and there's this rhythm you can fall into: jump, trick, land, boost, repeat. It's quite addicting in all honesty. What really made Pure stand out was its track design. Each race is packed with huge ramps, shortcuts, and alternate paths. There's also a deep customization system where you can build your ATV from the ground up. Every part, from frame to engine, affects performance. However, if you're not super into the customization, there's also just a button that makes a good build for you, so you don't have to worry about that if you're not interested. Visually, Pure still looks great today, with sprawling landscapes and impressive draw distance for its time, and the dirt and mud effects are pretty cool as well. Sadly, at least in my opinion, it was overshadowed by bigger names like MotorStorm and MX vs ATV Reflex, but Pure deserves to be mentioned in the same breath, maybe even above them. Now, in terms of review scores, the Xbox 360 version out of the 3 different versions holds the highest score of 85 out of 100. It also went on to sell very well with just shy of 2.5 million copies sold. So how is this an underrated game, I hear you ask? Well, dear viewer, I think it's just been one that's forgotten over time and thus has fallen into the realms of underratedness, if that's even a word. If you disagree that it's underrated, that's also fine, but I hope you can agree that this is a fantastic game. I do miss that era where Disney Interactive Studios would publish non-Disney themed games, such as Pure, Spectrobes, or Split Second. It was a good time, and I wish we could go back to it. Now, these days, when you think Xbox racing, most people jump straight to Forza. But before that, there was Project Gotham Racing, and Project Gotham Racing 3, which was a launch title that redefined what stylish racing looked like. Now, I'm just going to clear the air here, this game was definitely not underrated at the time. No way. But it certainly has become that way now, with the focus shifting towards Forza as the years went on and Microsoft seemingly forgetting about this franchise's existence. Anyway, now that's cleared, let's talk about it. The game was developed by Bizarre Creations and launched alongside the console in 2005. Project Gotham Racing wasn't just about finishing first, it was about driving with style. The kudos system rewarded you for precision, clean lines, near misses, and perfect drifts. And this system had been perfected over previous releases, starting with Metropolis Street Racer all the way back on the Dreamcast. The game featured meticulously modelled cars, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Aston Martins, and real-world cities like London, Tokyo, and New York, all recreated in stunning detail for 2005. The attention to lighting, reflections, and atmosphere made it a true next-gen showcase. Even the soundtrack and ambient crowd noise added to the immersion. You could feel the city around you. Now, Project Gotham Racing 3 would go on to receive one more sequel, aptly titled Project Gotham Racing 4, but sadly, I'd say these have kind of faded into history after Bizarre Creations was bought by Activision and then closed down, so thanks a bunch guys. But revisiting it today, you realise how ahead of its time it was, striking perfect balance between arcade fun and simulation realism. Bizarre Creations had really perfected the formula they'd started all the way back on the Dreamcast. Now, in terms of critical response, the game received very positive review scores, holding an 88 out of 100 on Metacritic, with the game going on to sell over 600,000 copies, although I'm sure this is probably more, but those figures are from VG Charts. This is the second time I've discussed Project Gotham Racing 3 in an underrated racing games video, and I just love it so much. It's just such a good game, and it's such a shame that Bizarre Creations went the way it did and we've not had a sequel since 4 all those years ago. In my opinion, it's a series that's distinct enough from Forza Horizon and Motorsport to stand by itself and could have easily kept going today had Activision not been total heads. But hey, what's new? Now, moving on to our final game, we've got something tonally different. Joyride Turbo, an Xbox exclusive kart racer that started life as a Kinect game. Poor thing. Then reinvented itself the right way. The original Kinect Joyride was all motion controls and honestly not that great, but Joyride Turbo ditched all that, switched to traditional controller input, and instantly became so much better. It's bright, silly, and surprisingly competitive. So Joyride Turbo, much like its predecessor on the Kinect, was developed by Big Park and published by Microsoft themselves. The release came in May of 2012. It's kinda just Microsoft's Mario Kart and you just use your avatar, which is pretty cool. The tracks were bright and colourful and filled with shortcuts, hazards and collectible coins. You can explore massive stunt parks to find hidden cars and practice jumps, and the handling is exaggerated but also satisfying, easy for beginners yet rewarding for skillful drifters. And best of all, and of course it's the best for me, it's 4-player split screen, which is still so rare these days. Whether you're racing with friends or just trying to beat your best lap time, Joyride Turbo is one of those games that proves you don't need realism to have fun, just good design and a sense of humour. Now again, thankfully Joyride Turbo is one of those games you can still pick up today, as it was one of the first 100 titles on the Xbox backwards compatibility list all the way back in November of 2015. I'm pretty sure this ended up being one of the Games with Gold games at some point, because I don't remember buying this, but it's a game that I do own on my Xbox. Now, Joyride Turbo is actually the lowest reviewed game in this video, with it currently holding a 67 out of 100 on Metacritic, so still not terrible, but not that great either. You know, when people think of racing games on the Nintendo DS, the same name always comes up: Mario Kart DS. Now, I haven't been particularly well versed in Nintendo DS racing games, having only played Mario Kart DS, which was good, and Need for Speed Most Wanted, and Burnout Legends, which were not so good. And those bad games left a sour taste in my mouth, so I went in search of some racing games on the DS that people weren't talking about to replace that sour taste with the sweet goodness of quality racing games. There were games I found that tried weird ideas, pushed the limits of what the little handheld could do, or just brought surprisingly good racing to a system not really known for its horsepower. So today we're looking at a few underrated DS racing games that definitely deserve a second lap. These aren't in any particular order, we're just gonna yap about some good racing games. Let's start with one that was ahead of its time in ways people still don't talk about. So first up, TrackMania Turbo. If you've ever played TrackMania on PC or consoles, you know the deal. It's all about fast laps, crazy stunts, and pure skill-based time trials. Something I'm not particularly good at. No power-ups, no rubber banding AI, just you, the clock, and some of the most insanely ridiculous track designs you'll ever see. But here's the wild thing. In 2010, Firebrand Games somehow squeezed that TrackMania magic into the two screens of the Nintendo DS. And somehow it actually worked. You got over 100 tracks split across 4 different environments, and even a fully functional track editor. On the DS! That's right, you could build your own tracks with ramps, loops, and jumps, and then just race them right away. That level of track editor being on the DS completely blew me away. You know, does it look great in terms of modern standards? No, but on the DS this is absolutely fantastic. It's the kind of feature that felt almost unreal. Now, the graphics obviously took a hit compared to console and PC versions, simplified models and low draw distance, and occasional performance issues. But the feel of TrackMania is right there. The handling's tight, the speed feels right, and I had that sense of just one more try that the series is known for. One of the coolest things for me was how each environment actually changed how the car behaves. Like the desert tracks were all about sliding around, while the classic stadium ones rewarded precision and control. To me, it gave the game a surprising amount of depth for something that looks quite simple. This could have easily just been a conversion of a console version that didn't translate well, but TrackMania Turbo was designed for the DS, and that makes all the difference. It feels fast, focused, and just fun. Honestly, I find it so impressive how much they managed to cram in this game. You could tell Firebrand really understood what made TrackMania tick. It's not about fancy graphics, it's about a perfect flow, and this DS version really nailed it. Unfortunately, it didn't get heaps of attention at release, with VG charts estimating the game to have sold only about 50,000 copies, but the game reviewed pretty well with a 77 out of 100 average on Metacritic. But I'm thinking mostly because by 2010, the DS was kind of already winding down and ending its era. People were looking towards the 3DS, which was launching the following year. If you ever stumble across a copy, give it a go. It's the kind of game that's A, fun, and B, will make you go, how does this even run on this console? Okay, so now for one of my personal favourites, Sideswiped. If you've never heard of it, Don't worry, because it seems to me that most people haven't. This one came out in 2009, published by Majesco and developed by Recom. It's basically Burnout, but on a much lower budget. But honestly, it works way better than it has any right to. The whole idea is completely simple: cause as much chaos as possible. You earn points for smashing into traffic, wrecking opponents, or just basically flying all over the place. It's arcade style mayhem with short bursts of fun that I thought were perfect for handheld play. Unlike a lot of DS racers, Sideswiped just goes all in on destruction. And it really puts the Burnout port on DS to shame. Every crash can send cars flying, and it makes me laugh every single time because it just looks so funny. The game keeps rewarding you for being reckless. It was just pure dopamine rush. The art style's pretty cool too. It's got this colourful, kinda cel-shaded look that gives it personality without straining the DS hardware too much. It's almost like a comic book version of a Crash Derby. And all things considered, bearing in mind how much is going on the screen at any moment, the frame rate is surprisingly solid. You can tell the devs focused on keeping things smooth and fast, even if it meant simplifying some visuals. The missions are all quite short, like 1 or 2 minutes each, but that's part of the charm. It's the kind of game you can pick up, do a few challenges, and put back down again. But it's addictive because you're constantly chasing a better score, trying to chain bigger crashes, or get that perfect run. Or in my case, send as many cars flying to the moon as you possibly could. There's also this satisfying sense of feedback, where the cars explode and bounce about in an almost cartoonish style. It's just fun, really, like unapologetically fun. You can tell it's a game that didn't have a huge budget, but it certainly made the most of what it had. The menu design, the stylized vehicles, the little touches like camera shake, it all comes together to make something quite unique. It's certainly not realistic, but it definitely doesn't need to be. It's arcade chaos done right. If you're the kind of player who loves Burnout mayhem, Sideswiped is a hidden gem you should definitely track down. It's the definition of an underrated DS racer. One that does its own thing, doesn't overcomplicate it, and ends up being way more fun than it looks. I wasn't able to find any review scores for this game, but there's one user score on Metacritic putting it at an 8 out of 10. It also was only estimated to have sold about 10,000 copies as per VG charts. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. So next up, let's talk about Ridge Racer DS. Now, Ridge Racer is one of those legendary arcade franchises that helped define 90s racing. Bright tracks and smooth drifts, and that unmistakable announcer yelling Ridge Racer. So when Namco decided to bring it to the DS as a launch title back in 2004, it definitely made sense. But here's the thing, Ridge Racer DS kind of flew under the radar due to the passage of time, and it really shouldn't have. First off, this game actually feels like classic Ridge Racer. The handling is buttery smooth, like slide around corners with a smile kind of smooth, the kind of smooth I'd expect from a console or arcade version of Ridge Racer, so it's nice to see it's translated well here. It's got that perfect balance between arcade speed and precise control, and visually I think it's one of the best looking early DS games. It's based on Ridge Racer 64, so it's definitely not original, but that's not a bad thing, because that game was already great. The DS version keeps the same track layouts, the same fast-paced drifting, and that same flashy arcade energy, except now you can play it anywhere, and you don't need a big clunky cartridge for it. One thing people forget is that Ridge Racer DS actually tried some interesting stuff with the DS hardware. Like, you could use the touchscreen as a steering wheel. I couldn't get on with this at all, so I just stuck to the D-pad, but hey, it's there if you want to use it. That feature to me kind of felt like a tech demo for an early mobile racer, but it's cool that they tried, and I'm going to give them credit for that. As I mentioned, thankfully you could use the D-pad, which feels a lot more natural. And once you get into that rhythm of power sliding through turns, it really scratches that Ridge Racer itch. Soundtrack-wise, it's pure Namco goodness, upbeat techno tracks that keep your heart pumping while you race through sunny city streets and neon tunnels. It's got that vibe of a game that doesn't take itself too seriously, It just wants you to have fun, and that's the kind of thing that I like in a racing game. The big reason it didn't get more love, in my opinion, is timing. You see, in every region where Ridge Racer released, there was less than 12 months between that and the launch of Mario Kart DS, with there being less than 5 or 6 months in some regions like Europe. Now, in terms of review scores, Ridge Racer DS holds a OK score of 63 out of 100 on Metacritic, and it's sold alright as well, with 150,000 copies estimated to have been sold. But if we compare that to Mario Kart DS, which followed shortly after, that game sold 23 million units. A lot more. But if you can look past the shadow of Nintendo's mascot racer, Ridge Racer DS delivers some genuinely solid arcade action. It's stylish, smooth, and I thought it was a complete blast to play. So it's not groundbreaking, but it's proof that the DS could handle classic style racing just fine. And in my opinion, it still feels good 21 years later. Alright, so this next one might surprise you. Cars Meta National Championship for the DS. Yeah, that's right, we're talking Cars, the sequel to the movie tie-in game on the DS. But hear me out, this version is actually really good. This one was developed by Tantalus Interactive, the same folks who did the Game Boy Advance version. And if you remember that Game Boy Advance port, it was a pretty impressive 3D racer. But the DS version is basically the full experience that the GBA version was trying to be. In fact, the GBA release is pretty much just a scaled down version of this one. They even managed to include that cursed opening cutscene, you know, the one.
Ladies and gentlemen.
But here it's actually a real CGI cutscene, not just a slideshow of JPEGs with text underneath. Now don't get me wrong, most of the other cutscenes are still static images with dialogue boxes, but that's totally fine. Nobody was expecting Pixar quality animation on a DS cartridge in 2007. And speaking of that, this came out in late 2007, and fun fact, the DS version actually had the highest Metacritic score out of all the platforms, sitting at a very respectable 69 out of 100. The game also sold pretty well, with just under 700,000 copies shifted for the DS. For comparison, the DS version of the first Cars game only scored a 54 out of 100, which is just quite sad. Now, having played the console version of Meta National, it's a surprisingly faithful adaptation, just without the open world elements. Instead, you end up with a series of compact but well-designed tracks that still manage to capture the Radiator Springs charm. The track design here, in my opinion, is genuinely solid. There are hidden shortcuts, collectible icons scattered around, and some clever course layouts that make it feel like more than a basic movie tie-in sequel. You've got jumps, drift mechanics, and races featuring all the international competitors from the main game. It's light-hearted, colourful, and honestly, a good time. It's definitely on the easier side, it is a Cars game after all, but it's not nearly as mindless as the GBA version was. You can actually get into a groove with the handling, chaining drifts, and nailing shortcuts like it's Mario Kart Lite. Now I do have to mention the one thing that's truly cursed about this game, and I've mentioned it before, the model for Lightning McQueen. Ugh, damn.
Holy God, what are you showing me? Come on.
I'll use the exact same phrase I used last time, and it's just cooked beyond belief. There's just something about it that isn't right, but hey, we love him anyway. Now, as much as I'm praising it, it's not a perfect game. There are a few tracks where the handling feels weird, but the worst offender, hands down, is this one segment where you race in a dark cave at night, because Lightning, as I'm sure you know, doesn't have real headlights, he's got stickers. So he wears night vision goggles, which puts this awful green tinted filter that makes it feel like you're doing a Spec Ops mission on Call of Duty. Cool idea on paper, but in reality it's just awful. I did not enjoy it. But aside from that one race with a weird design choice, Meta National Championship on the DS is genuinely impressive. It's fun, it's charming, and it runs smoothly. And finally, let's talk about Race Driver Grid. Yes, that Grid, on the DS. Now, most people know Grid as a console and PC franchise known for its realistic visuals and deep handling model. So naturally, when they announced the DS version, everyone thought, okay, this is not going to be good. But no, somehow, beyond all expectations, the DS version actually slapped. This one was developed by Firebrand Games. Yeah, the same team behind TrackMania Turbo. And honestly, these guys were wizards when it came to DS racing tech. They managed to make a version of Grid that kept the feel of the original, even if it didn't have the graphics to match. You've got a career mode and even proper licensed tracks and cars. And what's crazy is that it all runs smooth, controls well, and looks surprisingly sharp for a DS title. The car models are clean, the environments are varied, and the sense of speed is actually pretty damn good. What really makes it stand out to me though is how refined it feels. The physics are impressive, cars actually handle differently depending on their type, and you can sense weight shifting as you corner or brake. It's certainly not simulation level depth, but for the Nintendo DS, it's way beyond anything I was expecting. They even included a replay feature, something almost no other DS racers had. You could watch your race back, complete with camera angles, and it looked pretty good. It's that little extra polish that makes it clear Firebrand really cared. There's a good amount of content as well, lots of events, multiple vehicle classes, and enough difficulty to keep you invested. It's got that perfect balance of challenge and accessibility. The soundtrack's pretty good, the presentation feels good, and it's a game that genuinely impressed me with how hard they tried and how much they pulled off. And yet, it still kind of went unnoticed, with only 50,000 copies estimated to have been sold. Maybe because people assumed the DS couldn't handle something like Grid, or maybe because handheld racers were just not of interest at this point. But if you're into technical racers and want to see the DS push to its limits, this is one to play. The game holds a very nice 79 out of 100 on Metacritic for the DS version as well, which is very good going. If you grew up with a PSP, you know how good it felt to play. That glossy black screen lighting up in the dark, the faint hum of the UMD spinning inside, and the realization that somehow this tiny handheld was running games that felt way bigger than they had any right to be. The PSP wasn't just another portable console, it was Sony trying to bring full-scale PlayStation experiences into your backpack. And honestly, that ambition was very obvious in its racing games. Sure, everyone remembers the heavy hitters, Burnout Legends, a lot of Need for Speed games, Gran Turismo. Those games got the marketing, the magazine covers, the whole shebang. But beneath those more popular titles was a second layer of racing games, ones that took risks, experimented with structure, or quietly delivered something special without a massive franchise name behind them. Well, in some cases. These are the underrated PSP racing games. Certainly not bad games, not even forgotten games, just titles that, in my opinion, deserved more attention than they ever got. And today we're diving into 5 of them. So these are in no particular order, this is just a celebration of developers who looked at the PSP's limitations and pushed it. So let's get into it. So let's start off with a game called GripShift. At first glance, GripShift doesn't look like that much. The camera sits high above the car, the tracks are clean and minimal, and there are no licensed vehicles or flashy cutscenes trying to sell you on realism. If you judge this game by screenshots alone, you'd probably assume it was a budget arcade racer. But if you did, you could not be more wrong. GripShift is less about racing other cars and more about racing the track itself. Instead of traditional lap-based competition, most events are time trials filled with obstacles, jumps, moving platforms and physics-based challenges that demand absolute precision. The real star of GripShift is its handling model. Cars slide constantly, momentum is everything, and braking too late by even a fraction of a second can send you flying off the course. This isn't chaos for the sake of chaos, it's intentional. Every track is designed like a puzzle, and your car is the tool you use to solve it. So GripShift was developed by a company called Side, I believe it's pronounced, and was published by Ubisoft here in PAL regions. It released exclusively for the PSP in 2005 and would later go onto the PS3 via the PlayStation Network in 2007, and eventually to the Xbox 360 via the Xbox Live Arcade later on in 2007. Early on, the game can honestly feel almost unfair. It has quite a steep learning curve, and GripShift doesn't really hold your hand. It kind of expects you to fail, restart, and slowly internalize how the physics work. But once that understanding begins to click, well, then the game transforms. Suddenly you're not just driving, you're calculating angles, managing speed mid-air, and lining up landings with surgical precision. At least that's the hope. Shaving a second off of your best time feels genuinely quite rewarding because you know it came from skill and practice, and not just luck. GripShift was underrated largely because it didn't really fit neatly into a genre box. It wasn't a traditional racer, but it wasn't marketed as a puzzle game either. But for players who enjoy mastery-based gameplay, it's one of the most satisfying experiences on the PSP. In terms of critical response, GripShift would go on to hold a 70 out of 100 on Metacritic, with a user score a bit lower of 5.8 out of 10. This definitely isn't a game for everyone. In terms of sales, the game would go on to shift about 90,000 units, so not very many at all. Anyway, let's move on to our next game. So if GripShift is all about abstraction and physics puzzles, ToCA Race Driver 2 is about realism, and it takes that realism very seriously. This is a full-blown motorsport simulation, somehow condensed onto a handheld system that most people were using to play quick arcade games on the go. ToCA Race Driver 2 doesn't just drop you into random races, it builds a structured career that mirrors real motorsport progression. You begin as an unknown driver, gradually working your way through touring cars, open wheel events, GT racing, so on and so forth. There's a lot of different kinds of racing here. So whilst most versions of ToCA Race Driver 2 launched in 2004, the PSP version launched in September of 2005, and this version, rather than being developed by Codemasters, was handled by Sumo Digital, who have handled a lot of different racing games over the years. Each racing discipline feels distinct, cars handle differently, tracks demand different strategies, and success depends on understanding braking points, corner entry, and throttle control, rather than simply holding the accelerator down, which is such a me thing to do. What's most impressive is how weighty the cars feel. Vehicles have mass, traction varies depending on conditions, and mistakes are punished quite harshly. If you drive aggressively without respect for the physics, you will spin out. Quite a lot. Visually, the game pushes the PSP quite hard. Large grids of cars, detailed circuits, and much more come at a performance cost, but it's a trade-off that works in ToCA's favour. The slight roughness only reinforces the sense that you are playing something very ambitious. ToCA Race Driver 2 was underrated because it demanded commitment. It wasn't really designed for 5-minute play sessions, and it didn't offer instant gratification. But for players willing to invest the time, it delivered one of the deepest and most authentic racing experiences available on the PSP. Now, in terms of critical response, it doesn't have enough critic reviews to hold a Metacritic score, but Eurogamer gave it an 8 out of 10, and that seems pretty fair to me. And the game would go on to sell approximately 250,000 units, which is pretty impressive. So moving away from the simulation side of things, we have FlatOut Head On. FlatOut Head On is loud, messy, and very unapologetic about that fact. Where ToCA rewards discipline, FlatOut thrives on destruction. Cars are heavy, suspension is loose, and every race feels like it's one bad corner away from total disaster. And that's exactly the appeal. The physics engine is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Vehicles don't just crash, they crumple, shed parts, and react somewhat believably to impacts. Slamming into another car feels powerful, and wiping out at high speed has a real sense of consequence. So FlatOut Head On was developed by Bugbear Entertainment, who were the developers behind the original FlatOut games before it all went downhill when someone else took over with FlatOut 3. It's basically a port of FlatOut 2 with the soundtrack of Ultimate Carnage, which in itself was an enhanced version of FlatOut 2, so I guess it all comes full circle. Head On was released exclusively on the PSP in 2008. What makes FlatOut special isn't just the destruction though, it's how consistent the chaos is. Once you understand how the cars behave, you can actually use the madness to your advantage. Sliding through corners, bouncing off opponents, and riding the edge of control becomes part of the strategy. Head On isn't a lazy port either. The PSP version included reworked tracks, additional events, and performance tweaks that made it feel tailored to handheld play rather than compromised by it. Despite all of this, FlatOut Head On released in a rather crowded market. Burnout was dominating the arcade racing conversation, and Need for Speed was also soaking up mainstream attention. FlatOut quietly delivered one of the most entertaining races on the system, and not that many people actually noticed. In terms of its critical response, FlatOut Head On would receive pretty positive reviews, holding a 74 out of 100 on Metacritic, and a user score of 8.5 out of 10, so even better. The game would go on to sell about 290,000 units as well, which is pretty good going, just not the highs of Burnout or Need for Speed. Right, let's talk about ModNation Racers. ModNation Racers is one of those games where you just had to be there. That's the best way I can describe it. It could be one of the most ambitious handheld racing games ever made. At its core, it's an arcade kart racer with accessible handling and colourful visuals, but that description barely scratches the surface of what it's actually trying to do. The defining feature of ModNation Racers, of course, is customization. Not just cosmetic tweaks, but deep creative control. You can design your own character, build your own kart, and most impressively create your own racetracks from scratch. And this isn't some stripped down editor either. You sculpt terrain, place jumps, create shortcuts, and design entire courses using tools that are surprisingly intuitive on the PSP's control layout. So ModNation Racers was a PlayStation exclusive, releasing in May 2010 for both the PSP and the PlayStation 3. The game was developed by United Front Games and San Diego Studio, and of course published by Sony themselves. The game used the same play, create, share tag that Little Big Planet held, as it was primarily based around user-generated content. The racing itself strikes a solid balance between chaos and skill. Power-ups exist, but success still depends on drifting well, managing boosts, and understanding the flow of each track. It feels familiar enough to fans of kart racers while still having its own identity. ModNation Racers PSP was underrated largely due to timing. It launched quite late in the PSP's lifecycle, when attention was already shifting elsewhere. Its biggest strengths also relied on community engagement, which was harder to sustain on a fading platform. Even so, as a creative sandbox racer, it remains one of the boldest ideas ever attempted on a handheld system. And it still holds up pretty well now, alongside the PS3 version of the game. Now, in terms of critical response, ModNation Racers for the PSP holds a 73% out of 100 on Metacritic, and in terms of user score it holds a 6.9 out of 10, so not that bad. The PSP port would also go on to sell over 500,000 units, which is pretty good going. Now, before we touch on our final game, I just want to give an honourable mention to OutRun 2006 Coast to Coast. I don't think this game is underrated, but if we're talking PSP racing games, I'm talking about it anyway because it's absolutely fantastic. The game is literally arcade racing distilled into its purest form. The drifting feels effortless, the sense of speed is unmatched, and the branching routes ensure that every run feels fresh. It has an iconic soundtrack, an unmistakable visual style. It's a game that feels timeless on pretty much every platform, even today. And considering this is a handheld port of a game that released on PS2 and the original Xbox, this is pretty damn impressive. OutRun 2006 proves that realism isn't necessary for greatness, sometimes atmosphere and flow are all you need. Anyway, let's move on to our final game of the video. So lastly, we have Test Drive Unlimited. Test Drive Unlimited on PSP feels almost impossible. Not because it's perfect, but because it just exists. At all. Instead of traditional menus and isolated tracks, the game gives you a fully explorable Hawaiian island. You don't just select races, you drive to them. Highways, coastal roads, mountain passes, it's all connected. This open world structure completely changes the tone of the game. Test Drive Unlimited is a game that's not in a hurry. It encourages cruising, exploration, and immersion in car culture rather than non-stop competition. So the game originally was exclusive to the Xbox 360, releasing in late 2006, but eventually in 2007 along came a Windows PC, PS2, and PSP port, with this version of the game specifically being developed by Atari Melbourne House. I was a massive fan of the 360 version of this game, and I'm really impressed with how well it was ported onto the PSP. Buying new cars, taking them out for long drives, and simply existing in the world becomes part of the appeal of this game. It's less about winning races and more about the feeling of freedom. Of course, compromises were necessary, frame rates dip, the visuals are a bit simplified, and performance can be uneven. But those sacrifices are what allowed the game to attempt something no other PSP racer dared to. Test Drive Unlimited was underrated because it didn't cater to instant excitement. It rewarded patience and curiosity, and that's qualities that often go unnoticed in handheld gaming. So in terms of critical response, Test Drive Unlimited on the PSP had a generally favourable reaction with 80 out of 100 for its critical score. And in terms of its user reviews, it holds an 8.2 out of 10, so pretty favourable as well. The game would go on to sell about 500,000 units, with most of those being sold in Europe. All my stats today are from VG charts. So there we have it, some underrated PSP racing games, or at least underrated in my opinion. The PSP wasn't just home to racing games, it was a testing ground for some pretty cool ideas. Developers experimented with simulation physics-driven gameplay, open worlds, and deep customization on hardware that wasn't built for any of it. Some of these games struggled commercially, others were overshadowed by bigger names, but all of them contributed to what made the PSP such a special, cool console. If you still own a PSP or you're exploring its library today, these racers are absolutely worth your time. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support, and all I really have left to say is thanks and goodbye.